Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. Sometimes that chance comes wrapped in the most unlikely package. In 1882, Montana Territory, wealthy widow Cordelia Ashworth rides through a blizzard to find Solomon Thorne, a mountain man who left society behind. She needs him to marry her for 24 hours. Solomon thinks she's lost her mind, but Cordelia is fighting for her life. Her late husband's will has a strange clause. She must remarry before her 60th birthday or lose everything to greedy railroad men. She has less than 1 day left. What starts as a desperate business deal becomes something neither saw coming. Two people who thought love was behind them discover it might just be beginning. But what happens when they're 24? Hours are up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The chess piece felt smooth between Solomon Thorne's weathered fingers as he contemplated his next move. The hand-carved knight, whittled from mountain pine during countless winter evenings, caught the amber glow of the kerosene lamp. Each piece in the set bore the marks of patient craftsmanship. A king with a noble bearing, a queen with flowing robes, pawns standing at attention like tiny soldiers. The chess set represented something precious in his solitary world, the marriage of intellect and artistry, strategy and beauty. Outside his cabin, the Montana Territory stretched endlessly under a blanket of fresh snow. The year was 1882, and civilization felt as distant as the stars overhead. Solomon had chosen this isolation deliberately, carving out a life in the wilderness where the only sounds were wind through pine boughs and the occasional call of a mountain hawk. He moved the night and leaned back in his chair, studying the board with the same intensity he once brought to business ledgers back in Denver. That life felt like someone else's story now. The failed mining venture that had cost him everything, the wife and daughter claimed by fever during the harsh winter of '78. The grief had nearly broken him then, but here in the mountains, surrounded by trees older than memory, he had found something resembling peace. The cabin reflected his methodical nature. Every tool hung in its designated place. Every surface bore the patina of careful maintenance. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth crackling with split oak that would burn steady through the night. Hand-hewn furniture filled the space. A sturdy table, 2 chairs he had crafted with mortise and tenon joints, shelves lined with books salvaged from his previous life. Philosophy, history, poetry, the intellectual companions of his exile. Solomon had just reached for his coffee cup when the sound reached him. Hoofbeats. Muffled by snow but growing closer, he set down the cup and listened, head tilted toward the window. Visitors were rare enough to warrant caution. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles down the valley, and travelers seldom ventured this far into the high country during winter storms. The knock, when it came, was tentative but persistent. 3 soft raps, then silence, then 3 more. Solomon rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He had learned patience in these mountains, learned to let events unfold in their own time. He opened the door to find a woman, standing on his threshold, and the sight stopped him cold. She was perhaps 58 years old, with silver-streaked auburn hair escaping from beneath a fur-trimmed hat. Her coat was finest wool, cut in the latest fashion, and her boots were polished leather that had never seen a day of honest labor. But it was her eyes that caught him, intelligent, desperate, and burning with determination. Mr. Thorne. Her voice carried the cultured tones of Eastern education, yet underneath lay something raw and urgent. My name is Cordelia Ashworth. I have a proposition that may sound quite mad, but I assure you I'm entirely serious. Behind her, a horse stood steaming in the cold, its flanks heaving from hard travel. The animal was quality stock, a thoroughbred mare built for speed rather than mountain trails. Snow clung to the woman's shoulders and hat, evidence of her journey through the gathering storm. "Ma'am," Solomon said carefully, "you're a fair piece from anywhere civilized. Storm's getting worse by the hour. You'd best come inside before you catch your death." She stepped across the threshold with visible relief, though her posture remained rigid with tension. In the lamplight, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the way her gloved hands trembled slightly. Whether from cold or nerves, he couldn't tell. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, glancing around the cabin with obvious surprise. Whatever she had expected to find in a hermit's dwelling, his tidy, book-lined refuge wasn't it. "I had heard you were an educated man, but I confess, I imagined something rather more primitive." Solomon gestured toward the chair opposite his own. "I find that books make better companions than most people. Coffee's fresh, if you'd like some." "Thank you." She settled into the chair with practiced grace, though her eyes continued to dart around the room, taking in details. Her gaze lingered on the chess set, the neat shelves of volumes, the quality of his furniture. "You're wondering how I found you?" The thought had crossed my mind. He poured coffee into a second cup, one of the few luxuries he allowed himself. Fine china from his former life. "Not many people know this place exists. I made inquiries in Missoula. A shopkeeper remembered selling you supplies. He said you were a gentleman, well-spoken and well-read. Someone who might understand a woman in unusual circumstances." Solomon handed her the coffee and resumed his seat, studying her face. Up close, he could see the exhaustion that careful cosmetics couldn't quite conceal, the tension that held her shoulders like a drawn bowstring. Whatever had driven her up this mountain through a blizzard, it wasn't a social call. "What kind of unusual circumstances?" he asked. Cordelia set down the coffee cup with a soft clink of china on wood. Her hands, he noticed, were soft and pale. The hands of a woman who had never known physical labor. The contrast between her obvious wealth and her desperate journey struck him as significant. "Mr. Thorne, I need you to marry me." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from the fireplace. Solomon felt his eyebrows rise, though he managed to keep his expression neutral. In his years of solitude, he had imagined many possible conversations with unexpected visitors. This wasn't one of them. "I beg your pardon?" "For 24 hours, she continued quickly, as if speed might make the proposal sound less insane. "A temporary arrangement, purely business. I can pay you handsomely for the inconvenience." Solomon leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The woman was clearly well-bred, well-educated, and under normal circumstances, probably quite rational. These were not normal circumstances. "Ma'am, I've been living alone up here for 4 years. Maybe the isolation's affected my hearing, because I could swear you just asked me to marry you for a day." A flush crept up her neck, but her gaze remained steady. "I realize how it must sound, but I assure you, Mr. Thorne, I am neither mad nor frivolous. My situation is desperate, and you are perhaps the only man in the territory who might help me." "Why me? You don't know me from Adam's house cat." "Because," she said quietly, "you're a man who left civilization behind by choice, not by circumstance. That suggests someone who values independence over social convention. Someone who might understand that sometimes the rules of proper society must be bent in service of justice." Solomon found himself impressed despite his bewilderment. She had sized him up quickly and accurately, a skill that suggested considerable intelligence and experience reading people. "Justice," he repeated. "That's an interesting word choice." Cordelia reached into her coat and withdrew a folded document, its edges worn from handling. "My late husband, Charles Ashworth, died 6 months ago. We were married for 32 years. He was a good man, Mr. Thorne, but he had some rather eccentric ideas about women and independence." She unfolded the document, revealing dense legal text in formal script. "This is his will. Among other provisions, it states that I may inherit his estate only if I remarry before my 60th birthday. If I fail to do so, everything passes to his business associates, a group of railroad investors who have made no secret of their eagerness to claim my husband's holdings." Solomon studied the woman across from him with new interest. The desperation in her eyes made more sense now. as did her willingness to travel alone through dangerous weather to find him. "When's your birthday?" "Tomorrow." The word came out barely above a whisper. "At midnight I turn 60. If I am not legally wed by then, I lose everything. My home, my security, my independence, everything my husband built, everything we shared, will go to men who view me as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their profits." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Solomon could hear wind beginning to rise outside, rattling the windows with increasing force. The storm was intensifying, and even if the woman changed her mind about her bizarre proposal, traveling would soon become impossible. "Why didn't you remarry months ago? Surely there were conventional suitors." Cordelia's laugh held no humor. "Oh, there were suitors aplenty. Men half my age interested in my bank account. Men my age interested in controlling my decisions. None interested in honoring the memory of my marriage or respecting my autonomy. I realized that if I must remarry to satisfy the law, I would do so on my own terms. Terms that include dissolving the marriage after one day? Precisely. A marriage. Of legal convenience, nothing more. You would be well compensated, and we would part ways with our obligations fulfilled." Solomon rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the swirling snow. The chess game sat abandoned on the table behind him, its carved pieces frozen in mid-battle like soldiers waiting for a commander's next move. He had spent 4 years in these mountains, avoiding exactly this kind of complication. Other people's problems, other people's needs, other people's desperation. And yet something about Cordelia Ashworth intrigued him. Her composure in desperate circumstances, her willingness to travel alone into dangerous country, her refusal to accept defeat even when cornered by circumstances beyond her control. These were qualities he respected, even admired. "You mentioned compensation," he said without turning from the window. $5,000. Solomon's head turned sharply. $5,000 was more money than most men saw in 5 years. Of hard labor, it was enough to live comfortably for a decade, enough to buy land, stock, equipment, enough to transform a hermit's existence into something approaching prosperity. "That's generous," he said carefully. "It's fair compensation. For a significant favor." He studied her reflection in the dark window glass. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, waiting for his decision with the patience of someone accustomed to negotiating high-stakes agreements. There was steel in her spine, he realized, the kind of inner strength that came from facing life's hardships and refusing to break. "Where exactly do you propose we find someone to perform this ceremony?" "The nearest town is 20 miles through mountain passes, and this storm's going to make travel impossible within the hour." For the first time since her arrival, Cordelia smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face completely. "Reverend McKenna in Pine Ridge. He's performed emergency ceremonies before, and he's authorized to conduct marriages in the territory. If we leave immediately, we can reach town before the worst of the storm hits." Solomon turned from the window to face her directly. "And you're certain this will satisfy the legal requirements of your husband's will?" "Completely certain. The will specifies only that I be legally wed by my 60th birthday. It says nothing about the duration of the marriage or the motivations of the parties involved." Outside, wind howled through the pine trees with increasing fury. Whatever decision he made, it needed to be made quickly. Soon the mountain passes would become impassable, and Cordelia Ashworth would be trapped in his cabin until the storm passed, well past her midnight deadline. Solomon looked at the chess set, at the carved knight still poised for its next move. Sometimes, he thought, life forced a man to make bold moves or lose the game entirely. Sometimes the most strategic choice was the one that appeared most risky. "All right, Mrs. Ashworth," he said quietly. "I'll marry you." Cordelia reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a leather portfolio, its contents organized with the precision of someone accustomed to managing complex affairs. The will document she had shown him was only part of the story, Solomon realized. as she spread additional papers across his table with practiced efficiency. "I want you to understand exactly what we're dealing with," she said, her voice taking on the crisp authority of someone who had spent years managing substantial business interests. "These men aren't simply opportunistic. They're calculating predators who have been positioning themselves for this moment since before my husband's death." The papers told a story that made Solomon's jaw tighten with anger. Railroad expansion. Maps showing planned routes through property Charles Ashworth had owned. Correspondence between railroad executives discussing the widow problem with casual contempt. Financial projections that treated her inheritance as already claimed, with specific plans for liquidating assets and displacing tenants. Morrison, Blackwood, and Associates, Cordelia explained, tapping the letterhead on several documents. They were Charles's business partners in several ventures, but they've spent the past 6 months maneuvering to control everything he built. They're the ones who encouraged him to include that ridiculous marriage clause in his will, betting that a woman my age would never find a suitable husband in time. Solomon studied the correspondence with growing disgust. The language was coldly calculating, discussing her fate as if she were livestock to be disposed of rather than a human being with rights and dignity. "Why didn't your husband protect you better than this?" Cordelia's hand stilled on the papers. Charles was a brilliant businessman, but a man of his time. He genuinely believed that women needed masculine protection to survive in the world. The marriage clause wasn't intended as cruelty. In his mind, it was ensuring I would have a husband to guide and protect me in my later years. Instead, it made you vulnerable to wolves. Precisely. She gathered the papers with swift, economical movements. "Morrison visited me last week. He was quite confident that I would be forced to sell the estate to them at a substantial discount when I failed to meet the will's requirements. He even had the contracts prepared." The arrogance of it stoked something hot and protective in Solomon's chest. He had withdrawn from society partly to escape such men, those who viewed others as obstacles to their ambitions rather than fellow human beings deserving respect. "How much is at stake?" "The estate is worth approximately $200,000. Property, investments, business interests. Charles built something significant, and these men want to tear it apart for their own profit. $200,000. The sum was staggering, more wealth than entire towns possessed. Solomon began to understand why Cordelia was willing to travel through a blizzard and propose marriage to a stranger. The stakes couldn't be higher. "We need to leave now if we're going to reach Pine Ridge before the passes become impassable," he said, moving toward his coat and boots. Storms building faster than I expected. As he dressed for travel, Solomon's mind worked through the practicalities. Pine Ridge was 23 miles through mountain terrain that would be treacherous in good weather, potentially deadly in a blizzard. His horse was mountain-bred and sturdy, but carrying 2 riders through deep snow would slow them significantly. "K'nay, you handle hard riding?" he asked, assessing Cordelia's fine clothes and soft hands. "I'll manage whatever is necessary." Her tone brooked no argument, and Solomon found himself believing her. Desperation, he had learned, could transform anyone into something they never imagined themselves capable of becoming. They saddled his horse quickly, working together with surprising efficiency. Cordelia proved more capable than her refined appearance suggested, checking cinches and adjusting stirrups with movements that spoke of genuine familiarity with horses. Another layer to the mystery of who she really was beneath the wealthy widow's exterior. The journey began in relative calm, following a well-defined trail that wound down from the high country toward the valley where Pine Ridge nestled between protective ridges. But within the first hour, Solomon realized they were racing against something more dangerous than simply missing a deadline. The wind had shifted, bringing with it the kind of bone-deep cold that could kill exposed travelers. Snow fell harder and thicker, reducing visibility to mere yards ahead of their horse's nose. The trail, clear enough when they started, began disappearing under accumulating drifts. How much farther? Cordelia called over the wind's howl, her voice muffled by the scarf she had wrapped around her face. 15 miles, maybe 16. Solomon guided the horse around a fallen tree that hadn't been there on his last trip to town. Trails getting harder to follow. We may need to find shelter and wait for the storm to pass. No. The word came sharp and definite. We reach Pine Ridge tonight, or I lose everything. Solomon understood her determination, but weather in these mountains didn't negotiate. Nature set its own terms, and smart travelers learned to accept them. Still, something in her voice, a quality of absolute resolve that reminded him of soldiers he had known, made him push harder than caution recommended. They pressed on through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous. The horse struggled through, snow that reached its belly, each step requiring enormous effort. Ice formed on their clothes and equipment, adding weight and reducing mobility. Solomon's beard became a frozen mask, and he could hear Cordelia's teeth chattering despite her heavy coat. "There!" Solomon pointed through the swirling snow toward a distant glow. "That's Pine Ridge." The town appeared like a mirage through the storm. Warm, yellow light spilling from windows, smoke rising from chimneys, the blessed promise of shelter and warmth. But even as they approached the outskirts, Solomon realized their troubles were far from over. Pine Ridge, after dark, was a different creature than the sleepy farming community he remembered from previous visits. Saloons blazed with activity, their doors swinging constantly as cowboys and miners sought refuge from the storm. The main street churned with mud and slush as horses and wagons fought for passage. They found the parsonage without difficulty, a modest white house beside the community church, its windows glowing with lamplight. But when Solomon knocked, the door was answered not by Reverend McKenna, but by his wife, an elderly woman whose expression was grave with worry. "I'm sorry, but Reverend McKenna isn't here," she explained, inviting them into the warm parlor. "He rode out this morning to deliver last rites to old Mrs. Patterson, and with this storm he won't be back until tomorrow at the earliest." Cordelia's face went pale, and Solomon saw her hands begin to tremble. They had traveled through deadly conditions, risked their lives against the storm, only to find their goal unreachable. "Is there anyone else who can perform marriages?" Solomon asked. "A justice of the peace, maybe? Judge Whitman might help you. He's authorized to conduct civil ceremonies, though he's particular about his reasons for doing so. You'll find him at his house, the big yellow place on Elm Street." Hope flickered back to life in Cordelia's eyes as they made their way through town toward the judge's residence. The house proved easy to find, a substantial 2-story structure that spoke of prosperity and respectability. Warm light glowed from multiple windows, and smoke rose steadily from its chimney. Judge Whitman answered the door himself. A man in his 70s with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to making important decisions. He listened to their request with growing skepticism, his gaze moving between Solomon's mountain man appearance and Cordelia's obvious wealth. "You want me to perform a marriage ceremony at 9 o'clock on a stormy evening for 2 people who met today?" The judge's tone suggested he found the request both suspicious and potentially fraudulent. "Judge Whitman," Cordelia stepped forward, with the same authoritative presence she had displayed in Solomon's cabin. "I am Cordelia Ashworth, widow of Charles Ashworth. Perhaps you knew him." Recognition flickered in the judge's eyes. "Charles was a good man. I was sorry to hear of his passing. Then you'll understand why I need your help tonight. Charles's will contains a provision that requires me to remarry before my 60th birthday, which is in less than 3 hours. If I fail to meet this requirement, his business associates will claim his entire estate through legal maneuvering." The judge's expression grew thoughtful as he processed this information. "Business associates who would profit from your failure to comply with the will's terms." Exactly. Men who view women as inconveniences to be managed rather than individuals with rights. Judge Whitman stepped back from the door, gesturing them inside. "In that case, I think we need to discuss the specifics of your situation, and perhaps I can help ensure that justice prevails over mere legal technicality." As they entered the warm, book-lined study where the judge conducted his business, Solomon felt the first stirring of hope that their desperate gamble might actually succeed. But he also sensed that the real test of their unusual partnership was just beginning. Judge Whitman settled behind his desk, his weathered hands folded atop a worn leather blotter. In the lamplight, Solomon noticed the man's study bore the same careful organization as his own cabin: law books arranged by topic, papers neatly stacked, everything in its proper place. On the desk's corner sat a brass compass that had clearly seen considerable use, its face polished smooth by countless fingers. "That belonged to my father," the judge said, noticing Solomon's attention. "And his father before him. 3 generations of Whitmans have used that compass to find their way through difficult terrain, literal and metaphorical." Solomon understood the symbolism. Men who lived by principle needed reliable guides through life's complicated passages, just as travelers needed instruments to navigate treacherous mountains. "Now then," Judge Whitman continued, settling his spectacles more firmly on his nose, "let's discuss your unusual situation, Mrs. Ashworth. You say these business associates are positioning themselves to claim your husband's estate?" Cordelia withdrew the papers she had shown Solomon earlier, spreading them across the judge's desk with careful precision. "Morrison, Blackwood, and Associates. They've been planning this acquisition since before Charles's death. Here are the correspondence files showing their strategy." The judge read through the documents with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to separating legal truth from mere assertion. His expression grew grimmer with each page, and Solomon saw his jaw tighten with controlled anger. "Predatory behavior," the judge muttered. "They're treating your inheritance like a business opportunity rather than a personal matter. This Morrison fellow seems particularly confident that you'll fail to meet the will's requirements." "He visited me last week with purchase contracts already prepared," Cordelia said. "He was quite smug about my inevitable failure to find a suitable husband in time." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. In a gesture that reminded Solomon of his own contemplative postures, "Marriage is a sacred institution, not a legal technicality to be manipulated by grasping opportunists. The question becomes whether your proposed union serves the spirit of your husband's intentions or merely the letter of his will." "What do you mean?" Solomon asked. "Charles Ashworth was known to me as a man who valued genuine partnership in marriage. His own union with Mrs. Ashworth lasted over 3 decades and was, by all accounts, built on mutual respect and affection. I doubt he intended his will's provision to facilitate a purely mercenary arrangement." Solomon felt a stab of discomfort. Their proposed marriage was exactly that, a business transaction designed to circumvent legal requirements. But as he glanced at Cordelia, something in her expression suggested she was struggling with the same ethical complexities. "Judge Whitman," she said quietly, "I understand your concerns, but I must ask, is it more ethical to allow Charles's life work to be destroyed by men who view me as an obstacle to their greed, or to honor the spirit of his protection through unconventional means?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Solomon found himself studying both faces, the judge's contemplative wisdom and Cordelia's determined vulnerability. He was beginning to realize that their simple business arrangement might be more complicated than either had anticipated. "Tell me about yourselves," the judge said suddenly. "Not the legal requirements or financial stakes, but who you are as people. Mrs. Ashworth, what kind of woman were you during your marriage?" Cordelia's composure softened slightly, revealing glimpses of the person beneath the desperate widow's facade. "I was Charles's partner in every sense of the word." He consulted me on business decisions, valued my judgment on investments, trusted me to manage household affairs that included supervising 20 employees. I wasn't merely his wife. I was his confidant, his advisor, his closest friend. And you, Mr. Thorne? Solomon hesitated, unused to such personal examination. I was married once. My wife, Sarah, was everything good about this world. Kind, intelligent, patient with my flaws. We had a daughter, Mary. They both died in the fever epidemic of '78. The words came harder than expected, carrying with them the weight of grief he thought he had learned to bear. In the judge's study, surrounded by the trappings of civilized society, the losses felt fresh again. I came to the mountains because I couldn't stand being around reminders of what I'd lost, he continued. Up there, the silence doesn't judge you for failing to save the people you love most. Judge Whitman nodded slowly, recognition in his eyes of someone who understood profound loss. Grief can drive us to isolation, but it can also teach us the true value of human connection. The question becomes whether we allow our wounds to make us permanently closed to new possibilities. Solomon glanced at Cordelia and found her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Sympathy, certainly, but something else. Perhaps recognition of a kindred soul who had also learned that life could strip away everything that mattered in a single devastating blow. Your proposed marriage, the judge continued, begins as a legal necessity, but involves two people who understand both the value of genuine partnership and the pain of profound loss. That suggests possibilities. Beyond mere convenience, we hardly know each other, Cordelia pointed out, though her tone lacked conviction. Knowledge can be acquired, Judge Whitman replied. Character, however, is revealed through actions under pressure. Mrs. Ashworth, you traveled alone through dangerous country to seek help from a stranger rather than surrender to circumstances beyond your control. That speaks to courage and determination. Mr. Thorne, you agreed to help someone in desperate need despite your own preference for solitude. That speaks to fundamental decency and honor. The brass compass caught the lamplight as the judge reached for it, his fingers tracing its familiar contours. My father always said that a good compass doesn't just show you where you are, it helps. You find where you need to go. Sometimes the path isn't what you expected when you started the journey. Outside, wind rattled the windows with increasing fury, reminding them that time was growing short. The clock on the judge's mantel showed 10:30, barely 90 minutes until Cordelia's midnight deadline. I'm prepared to perform your ceremony, Judge Whitman announced, rising from his chair with renewed purpose. But I have conditions. What conditions? Cordelia asked. First, you will exchange genuine vows, not legal formalities but honest. Promises about your intentions toward each other, even if those intentions are limited in scope. Second, you will both understand that marriage, however brief or pragmatic, creates bonds between people that cannot be entirely dissolved by legal documents. Third, if this union develops into something more meaningful than either of you expects, you will have the wisdom to recognize and honor that development. Solomon felt his chest tighten. The judge was asking them to approach their practical arrangement with emotional honesty, something that could complicate everything. Do you both agree to these conditions? Judge Whitman asked. Cordelia looked at Solomon, her green eyes searching his face for some indication of his feelings. He found himself nodding before his rational mind could object, drawn by something in her expression that suggested she was as surprised by the judge's wisdom as he was. Yes, she said softly, we agree. Then let's proceed. We have a wedding to conduct and justice to serve. The wedding ceremony took place in Judge Whitman's study, witnessed by his wife, Martha, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman whose presence in the household spoke to the judge's progressive sensibilities. Cordelia stood beside Solomon before the fireplace, her traveling dress wrinkled from the day's journey, but her posture dignified and resolute. On her left hand, her original wedding ring caught the lamplight, a simple gold band that had witnessed 32 years of genuine partnership. Marriage, Judge Whitman began, his voice carrying the authority of both law and deep personal conviction, is fundamentally about two people choosing to face life's uncertainties together rather than alone. It requires courage to make such a choice, and wisdom to honor it properly. Solomon found himself studying Cordelia's profile in the flickering firelight. Her jaw was set with determination, but he caught glimpses of vulnerability in the way. Her hands trembled slightly, the quick dart of her eyes toward the mantel clock that showed 11:15. 45 minutes until her birthday, until everything she had built with Charles would pass into other hands. Solomon Thorne, the judge continued, do you promise to honor and protect Cordelia Ashworth as your lawful wife, to treat her with the respect and consideration due a partner chosen freely, and to remain faithful to the obligations you undertake here tonight, however long those obligations may last? The words carried more weight than Solomon had expected. This was supposed to be a simple legal formality, a business transaction dressed in ceremonial clothing. But standing before this wise old man, surrounded by witnesses who took the proceedings seriously, he felt the gravity of what they were undertaking. I do, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Cordelia Ashworth, do you promise to honor and respect Solomon Thorne as your lawful husband, to treat him with the consideration due a partner chosen in good faith, and to remain faithful to the obligations you undertake here tonight, however brief or extended they may prove to be? Cordelia's voice, when she spoke, carried a tremor of emotion that surprised them both. I do. The rings? Judge Whitman asked. Solomon felt a moment of panic. They had made no provision for wedding rings, an oversight that suddenly seemed significant. But Cordelia reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a small velvet pouch, from which she produced two simple gold bands. These were my parents' rings, she explained quietly. They were married for 47 years. I thought they might serve for tonight. The symbolism struck Solomon powerfully. Rings that had witnessed nearly half a century of genuine partnership, now pressed into service for their practical arrangement. As Cordelia slipped the larger band onto his finger, her touch was warm and surprisingly gentle. When his turn came to place the smaller ring on her hand, he found himself moving with careful reverence, as if the moment deserved more respect than their original intentions had warranted. By the authority vested in me by Montana Territory, Judge Whitman declared, I pronounce you husband and wife. Solomon, you may kiss your bride. The words hung in the air between them, and Solomon realized they hadn't considered this moment. Their arrangement was business, not romance, yet the ceremony demanded this traditional acknowledgement of their new status. Cordelia looked up at him, her green eyes wide with uncertainty that matched his own. He leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, a gesture more protective than passionate, more respectful than romantic. She exhaled softly, tension leaving her shoulders, as if his restraint had reassured her about his intentions. Congratulations, Judge Whitman said warmly, shaking Solomon's hand and embracing Cordelia with paternal affection. May your union bring you both peace, whatever form that peace may take. The clock chimed 11:30 as they completed the legal paperwork, Judge Whitman's careful script recording their marriage in the territory's official records. Cordelia Ashworth had become Cordelia Thorne, with half an hour to spare, her inheritance secure from the railroad men's grasping ambitions. Thank you, she said to the judge, her voice thick with gratitude. You've saved more than my financial security tonight. You've preserved Charles's legacy and protected everything we built together. Justice served is thanks enough, Judge Whitman replied, though I suspect tonight's work may prove more significant than any of us realize. The journey back to Solomon's cabin passed in contemplative silence, both riders lost in thoughts too complex for easy conversation. The storm had intensified while they were in town, transforming the mountain trail into a treacherous passage. Through wind-driven snow and ice, Solomon's horse struggled against drifts that reached its chest, each step requiring enormous effort. "Hold tight!" Solomon called over the wind's roar as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. Cordelia's arms tightened around his waist. Her body pressed against his back for warmth and stability. The intimacy of their position, necessary for safety but startling in its implications, reminded them both that their relationship had fundamentally changed in the past few hours. By the time they reached the cabin, both were exhausted and frozen, their clothes stiff with ice and their faces numb from the bitter wind. Solomon helped Cordelia down from the horse with careful attention to her obvious fatigue, noting how she swayed slightly on her feet before finding her balance. Inside the cabin, blessed warmth enveloped them like an embrace. Solomon quickly built up the fire, while Cordelia stood near the hearth, her teeth chattering audibly despite her efforts to maintain composure. Steam rose from their wet clothes as the ice began to melt. "Coffee?" Solomon offered, needing something to fill the awkward silence that had settled between them. They were married now, legally bound for whatever duration they chose, but strangers nonetheless, thrust together by circumstance into an intimacy neither had prepared for. "Please." She accepted the hot cup gratefully, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. "Solomon, we should discuss the practical arrangements. I don't wish to impose more than necessary." He studied her face in the firelight, noting the careful politeness that had replaced her earlier desperation. Now that her immediate crisis was resolved, she was presumably ready to return to her normal life and leave him to his solitude. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the fire. Storm's too dangerous for travel until morning anyway." "Thank you." She hesitated, then continued with obvious difficulty. "About the annulment proceedings, I assume you'll want to begin them as soon as possible." The question struck him oddly. 24 hours ago, returning to his solitary existence would have seemed like the natural conclusion to this strange interlude. But something had shifted during their evening together. Perhaps it was seeing her courage under pressure, or the way she had handled herself with Judge Whitman, or simply the unexpected compatibility he had sensed between them. "No rush," he heard himself saying. "Storm's likely to keep us snowed in for a few days anyway. We can discuss the future once we're both rested." Relief flickered across her features, though whether at the delayed decision or the prospect of a few days' respite from her normal pressures, he couldn't tell. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them like a benevolent chaperone. "Solomon," she said eventually, her voice softer than before, "I want you to know that tonight meant more to me than simple legal necessity. Your willingness to help a stranger, the respect you've shown me. It's been a long time since anyone treated me as an equal rather than a problem to be managed." The admission touched something in him he had thought long buried. "You're stronger than they give you credit for. That took real courage, coming up here alone in a storm." She smiled, the first genuine, unguarded expression he had seen from her. Charles used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. "I was terrified tonight, but the alternative was surrender, and that's not who I choose to be." As they prepared for sleep, an unexpected easiness settled between them. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight they were simply two people who had faced a crisis together and emerged victorious. The practical questions about their future could wait until daylight brought clearer perspective. Solomon settled into his chair by the fire, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and listened to Cordelia's quiet movements as she prepared for bed in the cabin's single room. The wedding ring on his finger felt strange, but not unwelcome, a reminder that sometimes life presented opportunities disguised as obligations. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, but inside the cabin, warmth and safety prevailed. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new complications, new questions about what they had begun tonight. But for now, Solomon was content to sit by the fire and contemplate the unexpected turn his solitary life had taken. In the bed across the room, Cordelia's breathing gradually deepened into sleep, and Solomon found himself wondering what dreams visited a woman who had risked everything on a stranger's honor, and discovered that sometimes, just sometimes, faith was rewarded. Solomon woke to silence, the profound, crystalline quiet that followed mountain storms. Pale morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, revealing a world transformed by nature's fury. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls nearly to the windowsills, and ice adorned every surface like nature's own jewelry. He rose carefully from his chair, muscles protesting after a night spent sleeping upright. The fire had burned low but not out, and he quietly added fresh wood before checking on Cordelia. She slept deeply, one hand curled beneath her cheek, her silver-streaked hair spread across his pillow like spun moonlight. In sleep, the careful composure she maintained while awake had softened, revealing the vulnerability beneath her determined exterior. Coffee brewing, Solomon stepped outside to assess their situation. The storm had deposited nearly 3 feet of fresh snow, making travel impossible for at least another day. His horse stood contentedly in the small stable he had built, well supplied with hay and grain. They were isolated but comfortable, a situation that would allow them time to navigate the complex dynamics of their new relationship. "Good morning." He turned to find Cordelia in the doorway, wrapped in the quilt from his bed, her hair hastily braided, but her eyes alert and intelligent. She had clearly been awake for some time, he realized, probably listening to determine his location before emerging. "Morning? Coffee's ready, and I've got bacon and eggs if you're hungry." "I should help," she said, moving toward the kitchen area with purpose. "I may have lived comfortably, but I'm not helpless." As they prepared breakfast together, Solomon found himself observing how she moved through his space, not with the tentative hesitation of a guest, but with the efficient grace of someone adapting to new circumstances. She seemed to understand, instinctively, where things belonged, how to work around him without collision or awkwardness. "You're comfortable in kitchens," he observed, watching her turn bacon with practiced skill. "Charles and I often cooked together, especially in the early years when we couldn't afford household staff. Some of my happiest memories involve sharing simple meals and conversation." Her expression grew wistful. "Luxury has its place, but there's something deeply satisfying about providing for yourself with your own hands." They ate in companionable silence, the easy rhythm of shared tasks having dissolved some of the strangeness between them. Outside, snow continued to fall in fat, lazy flakes, not the driving fury of the previous night, but the gentle persistence that would keep them. "Cabin-bound for hours yet. Tell me about your life before," Cordelia said eventually, her tone carefully neutral. "Before the mountains, I mean." Solomon hesitated, unused to such personal conversation. 4 years of solitude had made him protective of his past, reluctant to open old wounds, even to himself. But something in her expression, genuine interest rather than mere politeness, encouraged honesty. "I was a businessman in Denver, owned a small mining operation, had partnerships in several other ventures, thought I understood how the world worked." He paused, gathering courage for the harder parts. "Sarah and I married young, built something good together. When Mary was born, I thought my life was complete." He rose abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the endless white landscape. From his pocket, he withdrew a small leather folder, its edges worn smooth by countless handlings. Inside was a photograph, a woman with kind eyes and gentle smile, holding a dark-haired little girl who grinned at the camera with infectious joy. "They were everything," he said quietly, passing the photograph to Cordelia. "Sarah was the smart one, the one who kept me grounded when business success went to my head. Mary was pure sunshine, curious about everything, afraid of nothing, completely convinced that her papa could solve any problem." Cordelia studied the photograph with respectful attention, her fingers tracing the edges with careful reverence. They were beautiful. How old was Mary? 6. Old enough to have opinions about everything, young enough to believe in magic. The words came easier now, as if speaking them aloud might somehow honor their memory. The fever took them within days of each other. Sarah first, then Mary 3 days later. I couldn't save them. All my money, all my connections, all my plans for the future, none of it mattered when they needed me most. Oh, Solomon. Cordelia's voice carried genuine sorrow, the empathy of someone who understood profound loss. I'm so sorry. I sold everything after that. Couldn't stand being around reminders of what I'd failed to protect. Came up here thinking I'd live alone until I died, that maybe the mountains would teach me how to stop hurting. And have they? He considered the question seriously. They've taught me how to live with the hurt rather than trying to escape it. That's different, I suppose. Cordelia handed back the photograph, her movements gentle and respectful. Charles and I were never blessed with children. We tried for years, but it wasn't meant to be. Sometimes I wonder if that loss prepared me for losing him, as if grief trains you for greater griefs to come. The observation struck Solomon as profoundly wise. He had never considered that his earlier losses might have equipped him to handle larger devastations, but perhaps resilience was indeed something that developed through practice. Do you think about remarrying? I mean truly remarrying. The question surprised him even as he asked it. Before last night I would have said no. The idea of replacing Charles seemed impossible, even offensive. But marriage isn't replacement, is it? It's addition, building something new rather than trying to recreate something lost. They spent the rest of the morning in easy conversation, sharing stories about their past lives, their losses, their hard-won wisdom about survival and adaptation. Solomon found himself drawn to her intelligence, her ability to find meaning in suffering without becoming bitter or self-pitying. When afternoon brought a break in the snowfall, they ventured outside together. Solomon showed her his small garden plot, buried now under drifts but destined for spring planting. The chicken coop where his small flock weathered the storm in contentment. The workshop where he crafted furniture and tools during long winter months. You've built something beautiful here, Cordelia said, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Completely self-sufficient, integrated with the natural world rather than fighting against it. It's peaceful, Solomon agreed. Though sometimes the silence becomes oppressive, I find myself talking to the chickens just to hear a voice. Cordelia laughed, a sound like silver bells in the crystalline air. I talk to my roses, Charles used to tease me about it, but I swear they bloom better when they're properly conversed with. As they returned to the cabin, Solomon realized that the awkwardness of their unusual situation was gradually being replaced by something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine companionship. Whatever happened when the snows cleared and they were forced to make decisions about their future, these quiet hours of discovery were becoming precious in their own right. The wedding ring on his finger no longer felt foreign. Instead, it had begun to feel like a promise. Not just the legal obligation they had undertaken, but the possibility of something neither had dared hope for when their desperate bargain began. The second evening of their marriage found them settled by the fire, Solomon's hand-knitted blanket spread across both their laps as they shared the sofa he had built from mountain pine. The blanket carried memories. Sarah had made it during the long months before Mary's birth, her fingers working the soft wool while she hummed lullabies to her unborn child. For 4 years, Solomon had kept it folded away, too painful to use. Tonight, sharing its warmth with Cordelia felt like a gentle benediction, as if the past was offering its blessing to the present. "Tell me about your roses," Solomon said, genuinely. Curious about this woman who spoke to flowers and managed business affairs with equal competence. Cordelia's face lit with enthusiasm. "I have 12 varieties in my garden back in Helena. Everything from delicate tea roses to hardy climbers that can survive Montana winters. Charles indulged my passion completely, even built me a greenhouse so I could start seedlings early each spring." She described her garden with the same detailed affection Solomon felt for his mountain refuge. The careful selection of varieties, The attention to soil and drainage, the patient nurturing required to coax beauty from harsh conditions. Her hands moved as she spoke, sketching invisible blooms in the air between them. Roses are demanding companions, she continued. They require attention, consistency, protection from threats. But they reward that care with extraordinary beauty and the most heavenly fragrance imaginable. Sounds like they taught you patience. They taught me that worthwhile things take time to develop properly, that rushing the process usually results in disappointment, but patient cultivation can produce miracles. Solomon found himself wondering if she was still talking about flowers, or if the conversation had shifted to more personal territory. The quiet intimacy of their shared evening encouraged such deeper meanings, such careful explorations of possibility. "What will happen to your garden?" he asked. "Now that your inheritance is secure, will you return to Helena?" The question had been hovering between them all day, unspoken but present in every comfortable silence, every shared glance, every moment of unexpected harmony. Their marriage had accomplished its legal purpose, but it had also created something neither had anticipated, a genuine connection that complicated their original plan to simply part ways. "I don't know," Cordelia admitted, her voice soft with uncertainty. "Yesterday, returning to my normal life seemed inevitable. Tonight, that life feels like it belongs to someone else." "How so?" She gestured around the cabin, taking in the simple furnishings, the warm firelight, the profound quiet that surrounded them. "This peace you found, I understand its appeal now. In Helena, my days are filled with social obligations, business meetings, correspondence with lawyers and accountants. Important work, certainly, but it leaves little room for the kind of conversation we're sharing tonight." "You could have both," Solomon suggested carefully. "Keep your house in Helena for business, but spend time here when you need refuge from civilization's demands." The proposal surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. He had offered to share his sanctuary, something he would have considered impossible a week earlier. But Cordelia's presence had enhanced rather than disrupted his peace, adding warmth without destroying the fundamental tranquility he had worked so hard to achieve. "You would want that?" she asked, searching his face for sincerity. "I think I would. These past 2 days have reminded me that solitude and loneliness aren't the same thing. I chose solitude to escape pain, but I've discovered that sharing solitude with the right person actually deepens its value." Cordelia leaned back against the sofa cushions, her expression thoughtful. "Charles used to say that the best partnerships were between people who were complete on their own, but chose to become more than the sum of their parts together." Wise man he was, but he was also a product of his generation. He believed women needed protection more than partnership, guidance, more than independence. "Our marriage was happy, but it wasn't truly equal." Solomon studied her profile in the firelight, understanding dawning slowly. "You're not looking for another Charles." "No, I'm not looking for another father figure or benevolent guardian. If I marry again, truly marry, not just for legal necessity, it would need to be as an equal partner with someone who values my strength as much as my vulnerability." The conversation had taken on weight beyond casual speculation. They were discussing real possibilities now, testing the waters of something that might extend far beyond their original 24-hour arrangement. "I've never thought of marriage as a partnership between equals," Solomon admitted. "Sarah and I were happy, but I was definitely the decision-maker, the protector, the one who handled business while she managed the home. It worked for us, but—" "You're right, it wasn't truly equal. Could you imagine something different?" He considered the question seriously, remembering how naturally they had worked together preparing meals, how easily she had adapted to his daily routines without trying to change them, how much he valued her opinions and insights. "I think I could. These past days, watching you handle crisis with such grace, seeing how you think through problems, I'd be foolish not to value that kind of partnership." They sat in comfortable silence, each processing the implications of what they had just acknowledged. Outside, wind whistled through the pine trees with a sound like distant music, and snow continued its gentle accumulation against the windows. "Solomon," Cordelia said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper, "what if we didn't seek an annulment immediately? What if we gave ourselves time to see whether this compatibility extends beyond crisis circumstances? How much time? Through the winter, perhaps, until spring makes travel easy again. By then we'll know whether what we've found together can survive routine as well as emergency." The proposal made sense. More sense than rushing into permanent decisions based on 2 days of extraordinary circumstances. Winter would provide months of unhurried time to explore their developing relationship without external pressures or expectations. And if we decide we're better as friends than spouses, then we'll part with respect and gratitude for what we've shared. But if we discover that our partnership has the potential for something lasting, then we'll make it permanent. Solomon finished. A real marriage built on choice rather than necessity. Cordelia nodded, her green eyes reflecting the firelight like stars. Choice makes all the difference. Yesterday, I married you to save my inheritance. Tonight, I'm choosing to stay because I want to explore what we might become together. Solomon reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers with careful reverence. The wedding ring she wore caught the light. Not her original band, but one of her parents' rings that had witnessed 47 years of genuine partnership. Then we'll take the winter, he agreed, and see what spring brings. 3 days into their extended arrangement, Cordelia discovered Solomon's secret while helping him organize papers in his desk. She had offered to assist with correspondence. Her years managing Charles's business affairs had given her valuable experience with bookkeeping and filing, and Solomon had gratefully accepted. What she found among the neatly organized documents changed everything she thought she knew about the man she had married. The land deed was tucked between household receipts and supply orders, its official seals and legal language initially unremarkable. But as Cordelia read more carefully, her breath caught in her throat. The document didn't just establish Solomon's ownership of his mountain property, it detailed mineral rights to extensive copper and silver deposits that geological surveys had valued at over $300,000. Solomon, her voice carried a careful neutrality that he recognized as dangerous. He looked up from the firewood he was stacking, noting the legal document in her hands and the expression on her face. His stomach dropped as he realized what she had discovered, the secret he had kept even from himself most days, preferring to live as if the wealth didn't exist. "You found the mineral rights deed. You're wealthy." The statement came out flat, almost accusatory. "Wealthier than I am. You could buy my entire inheritance twice over and still have money left." Solomon set down the firewood and approached her slowly, recognizing the hurt and confusion in her eyes. "It's not that simple, isn't it?" Cordelia stood, the deed clutched in her hands like evidence of betrayal. "I came to you desperate, offering $5,000 for a day's marriage, thinking I was dealing with a poor mountain hermit who needed the money. Instead, I find you're probably the richest man in the territory. The money doesn't matter to me. Clearly, you live like a pauper when you could afford a mansion in any city you chose." Her voice rose with each word. 4 days of growing trust, beginning to crumble under the weight of his deception. "Why didn't you tell me?" Solomon sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 53 years. "Because wealth corrupts relationships. Every friendship, every romance, every business partnership becomes tainted by questions about motivation. People see the money instead of the man. So you decided to test me, to see if I would want you for yourself rather than your fortune." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. "I never planned for any of this to happen. Your proposal, our marriage, these feelings developing between us, none of it was calculated." Cordelia paced to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape that had seemed so peaceful moments earlier. Then why hide it? If the money truly doesn't matter to you, why not be honest from the beginning? The question forced Solomon to confront truths he had avoided examining too closely. Because I've been burned before. After Sarah and Mary died, when I was vulnerable and grieving, I learned how quickly people's attitudes change when they discover you have resources they want. Suddenly, everyone had the perfect investment opportunity, the ideal way for me to honor my family's memory by funding their schemes. He joined her at the window, their reflections ghost-like in the glass. I came to these mountains partly to escape that corruption. Up here, nobody knows about the mineral rights. I can be judged for who I am rather than what I own. But I'm not nobody, Cordelia said quietly. I'm your wife. And I've been sharing my most intimate thoughts and fears with someone who's been deceiving me about something fundamental. The accusation stung because it contained truth. Solomon had been deceiving her, even if unintentionally, even if from understandable motives. Their developing relationship had been built on incomplete information, and that foundation now felt dangerously unstable. You're right, he admitted. I should have told you once we decided to extend our arrangement, but by then I was enjoying being valued for qualities that had nothing to do with money. These past few days, you've seen me as a man worth choosing, rather than a fortune worth pursuing. Cordelia turned from the window to face him directly, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. How do I know that? How do I know you haven't been manipulating this entire situation from the beginning? Because 3 days ago you were a stranger with a bizarre proposition, and I had no reason to believe our arrangement would last beyond its legal purpose. Solomon's voice carried the weight of complete honesty. I helped you because your situation was unjust, and you showed courage in fighting it. Nothing more. And the growing attraction between us? The intimate conversations, the shared meals, the planning for our future together. Was any of that genuine? The pain in her voice cut deeper than any physical wound. Solomon realized that his well-intentioned secrecy had undermined everything. They had built together, transforming days of honest connection into something that now seemed calculated and false. Every moment has been genuine, he said urgently. My feelings for you, my desire for partnership, my hope that we might build something lasting together. None of that has anything to do with money or manipulation. How can I believe that when you've been hiding something so significant? Before Solomon could answer, the sound of approaching horses cut through their argument. Multiple riders moving fast despite the snow-covered trail. Both Solomon and Cordelia turned toward the sound, tension replacing their personal conflict as new danger announced itself. Who would be traveling in these conditions? Cordelia asked, her business instincts immediately alert to potential threat. Solomon moved to the window that faced the trail, peering through the glass toward the approaching riders. What he saw made his blood run cold. Railroad men. 3 of them armed, and they look like they mean business. Morrison's people. Has to be. Question is, how did they find us and what do they want? Cordelia's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. They want to challenge the validity of our marriage. If they can prove it was fraudulent or temporary, they can still claim my inheritance. The riders emerged from the tree line, their horses steaming from hard travel through difficult conditions. Solomon recognized the lead rider from wanted posters in Pine Ridge, Jake Morrison, nephew of the railroad baron, and a man with a reputation for solving problems through violence rather than legal channels. We need to be very careful here, Solomon said, moving away from the window. These aren't businessmen who'll be satisfied with legal arguments. They're enforcers who use fear and intimidation to get what they want. Then they don't know who they're dealing with, Cordelia replied, her earlier hurt transforming into fierce determination. I didn't survive 32 years of marriage to a strong-willed man and 6 months of fighting for my inheritance just to be intimidated by thugs. Solomon found himself admiring her courage, even as he worried about their safety. Whatever personal issues remained between them, they would have to wait. Their immediate concern was protecting themselves and their legal victory from men who operated outside the boundaries of civilized society. The knock on the door, when it came, was neither polite nor patient. Heavy fists pounded against the wood with clear intent to intimidate, and a rough voice called out with mock politeness, "Mrs. Ashworth, we know you're in there. Time to discuss your recent marriage and what it's going to cost to make your problems disappear." Solomon reached for the rifle that hung above the fireplace, checking its load with practiced efficiency. Cordelia moved to stand beside him, her earlier anger replaced by the focused intensity of someone preparing for battle. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. "We show them that some people can't be bought, threatened, or intimidated," Solomon replied grimly. "And we protect what we've built together, whatever that turns out to be." Solomon held the Winchester rifle with the easy familiarity of a man who had relied on such tools for survival, but his mind was calculating rather than panicking. The cabin's construction, thick logs, small windows, single entrance, had been designed with mountain winters in mind, but it also provided natural defensive advantages against human threats. "How many rounds?" Cordelia asked quietly, moving to the window that provided the best view of their uninvited guests. 30 in the rifle, another 20 in the ammunition box. Solomon was impressed by her practical focus under pressure. "You know firearms? Charles taught me to shoot when we lived in mining country. Said a woman needed to be able to protect herself when her husband was away on business." She peered carefully through the frost-etched glass. 3 men, all armed. The leaders dismounted and heading for the door. The other 2 are staying with the horses, but positioning themselves for a clear shot at the windows. "Professional tactics," Solomon noted grimly. These weren't amateur intimidators, they were experienced at this kind of work. "Mrs. Ashworth." The voice outside carried the false joviality of a man accustomed to getting his way through implied violence. "Jake Morrison here. I work for your late husband's business associates. We need to have a conversation about your recent marriage." "We don't want any trouble," Solomon called back, his voice calm but carrying clearly. "Mrs. Thorne is legally married and her inheritance is secure. You have no business here." Harsh laughter answered him. "Mrs. Thorne, that's rich. Lady shows up out of nowhere, marries a mountain hermit she never met before, and expects everyone to believe it's a real marriage. We're here to discuss the generous compensation my employers are willing to provide in exchange for an annulment, and a reasonable property settlement." Cordelia's jaw tightened at the casual dismissal of their union's legitimacy. "They're trying to buy us off, or intimidate us into compliance," Solomon replied. "Either way, they're operating outside the law." "What's your counteroffer?" Morrison called out, his tone growing less patient. "We can do this easy, or we can do it hard, but we're not leaving empty-handed." Solomon met Cordelia's eyes, seeing his own determination reflected there. Whatever personal conflicts remained between them, they were united in refusing to be bullied by men who viewed violence as a business tool. "There is no counteroffer," Solomon replied loudly. "The marriage is legal and permanent. Find yourselves different business opportunities." The silence that followed stretched long enough to be ominous. Solomon could imagine Morrison and his companions discussing tactics, weighing their options, deciding how far they were willing to escalate their intimidation campaign. "Cordelia," Solomon said quietly, using her given name for the first time since their argument, "I need you to know something before this goes any further." "What?" "Everything I've felt for you these past days, every moment of connection, every hope for our future together, it's been completely genuine. The money changes nothing about who I am or what I want from life." She studied his face, searching for sincerity in his weathered features. "Then why hide it?" "Because wealth makes people see you differently, even when they don't mean to. It changes the dynamic of every relationship. I wanted you to know me as Solomon Thorne, the man, before you knew me as Solomon Thorne, the heir to a mining fortune. But we're married, partners. Secrets between partners destroy trust. You're right. I was wrong to keep it from you, and I'm sorry." Solomon's voice carried the weight of complete honesty. "When we get through this, I'll tell you everything about my finances, my past, my fears about how money corrupts relationships. No more secrets." Cordelia nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "When we get through this. Not if. We will get through it. These men are bullies who rely on intimidation because they can't win through legitimate means. But bullies usually fold when they meet genuine resistance, and if they don't fold," Solomon's expression hardened, "then they'll learn that some people are willing to fight for what matters to them." The sound of breaking glass announced that Morrison's patience had run out. A rock crashed through the kitchen window, followed immediately by Morrison's voice. "Now stripped of all pretense at civility, last chance, folks. Come out and let's discuss this like reasonable people, or we'll come in and drag you out." "Kitchen window gives them a clear shot at the door," Cordelia observed, her voice steady. "Despite the escalating threat, they're trying to pin us down while Morrison positions himself for entry." Solomon was beginning to understand that Cordelia Ashworth possessed not just courage, but tactical intelligence, qualities that had probably served her well in business. Negotiations, and were proving invaluable in their current crisis. "Can you handle the rifle?" he asked. "Yes." "What are you thinking?" "They expect us to hunker down and wait for them to breach the door. Instead, we take the initiative." Solomon moved to the back wall, where a smaller window faced the tree line. "I go out the back, circle around, and approach them from behind, while you keep them focused on the front of the cabin. That's dangerous. You'll be exposed crossing open ground. Less dangerous than letting them dictate the terms of engagement." Solomon checked his coat pockets, ensuring he had adequate ammunition. "These men are used to terrorizing people who can't fight back. They're not expecting organized resistance." Cordelia moved to the rifle, checking its action with practiced competence. "How long do you need?" 10 minutes to reach a good position. When you hear me call out, that's your signal to demand they surrender." "And if they refuse?" Solomon's expression was grim but determined. "Then we show them that some principles are worth fighting for." Before leaving, he turned back to face his wife fully. The argument that had divided them seemed trivial now, swept away by the immediate necessity of protecting what they had built together. "Cordelia, whatever happens out there, I want you to know that these past few days have been the best of my life since Sarah and Mary died. You've reminded me that it's possible to find happiness again, even after devastating loss. Solomon, I should have told you about the money from the beginning. I should have trusted you to see past wealth to the man beneath. That was my mistake, born from old wounds and old fears." She crossed to him, rising on her toes to kiss his cheek with gentle affection. "We'll sort out the money and the trust issues after we deal with these thugs. Right now, just focus on staying alive so we can have that conversation." Solomon smiled despite their dangerous circumstances. "Yes, ma'am." The back window opened quietly, and Solomon slipped out into the bitter cold of the Montana afternoon. Snow crunched under his boots as he moved through the trees, using terrain and vegetation to mask his approach. The cold was sharp enough to make his lungs burn, but it also helped muffle sound and reduce visibility, advantages he intended to exploit fully. From his concealed position, he could observe Morrison's tactical setup clearly. The leader had positioned himself near the front door, using his horse as partial cover while maintaining a clear line of sight to the cabin's main entrance. His two companions flanked the building, their rifles trained on windows where they expected return.
Fire!
Professional positioning. But they had made a crucial error. They were focused entirely on the cabin, leaving their rear approach completely unguarded. Morrison's confidence in his intimidation tactics had made him careless about basic defensive precautions. Solomon worked his way closer, using the natural cover of boulder outcroppings and dense pine stands. The snow that had seemed like such an obstacle during their journey to town now provided perfect camouflage, his dark coat blending with shadow while his movements were muffled by the soft accumulation underfoot. "Time's up!" Morrison called out, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "We're coming in!" The crash of splintering wood announced Morrison's assault on the front door, followed immediately by Cordelia's sharp command from inside the cabin. "Stop right there! This is private property and you're trespassing. Lady, you're in no position to make demands," Morrison replied, though Solomon noted he had halted his advance. "Your mountain man can't protect you from all three of us." "Maybe not," Cordelia's voice carried clearly through the broken door, "but he can certainly make it expensive for you to try." Solomon had to admire her tactical thinking. She was buying time while keeping Morrison's attention focused forward. Exactly as planned, but he could hear the strain in her voice, the controlled fear of someone facing overwhelming odds with courage born of desperation rather than confidence. Time to change those odds. Solomon emerged from cover with the Winchester raised, his voice cutting across the clearing with unmistakable authority. "Gentlemen, you're surrounded. Put down your weapons, and we can discuss this without bloodshed." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Morrison spun toward the unexpected voice, his face showing genuine shock at finding his tactical advantage compromised. His companions swung, their rifles toward Solomon's position, suddenly aware that their assumed superiority had evaporated. "You've got one rifle against three," Morrison snarled, though his earlier confidence had noticeably diminished. "Math doesn't favor you, hermit." "Math's only part of the equation," Solomon replied calmly, stepping into clearer view while keeping his rifle trained on Morrison's center mass. "I know this terrain. I'm fighting for something that matters to me, and I've got nothing to lose. You're a long way from home, fighting for someone else's profit, and you've got wives and families who expect you to come back alive." The psychological pressure was deliberate and effective. Solomon could see doubt creeping into the faces of Morrison's companions, men who had signed up for intimidation work, not a genuine firefight against prepared opposition. "Besides," Solomon continued conversationally, "you're assuming my wife inside the cabin isn't also armed and trained. Mrs. Thorne, would you care to demonstrate your marksmanship for our guests?" Cordelia's rifle cracked from inside the cabin, and bark exploded from a tree 6 inches from Morrison's left shoulder, close enough to make the threat unmistakable, precise enough to demonstrate genuine skill rather than lucky accident. "Jesus!" One of Morrison's men swore, his rifle wavering as he realized their situation had deteriorated rapidly from comfortable intimidation to potentially deadly confrontation. "The way I see it," Solomon said, his voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, "you gentlemen have some choices to make. You can escalate this into a gunfight where people get hurt and you still don't accomplish your mission. You can retreat and explain to your employers why intimidation failed against people willing to fight for their rights. Or you can accept that Mrs. Thorne's marriage is legal, permanent, and none of your business." Morrison's face had flushed red with anger and embarrassment, but Solomon could see calculation in his eyes as well. The man was weighing costs and benefits, risks and rewards, trying to determine whether pursuing this confrontation was worth the potential consequences. "This isn't over," Morrison finally said, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "You think you've won something here, but you're wrong. There are other ways to handle problems like you." "Maybe," Solomon replied evenly, "but right now, you're going to mount up and ride out of here. And you're going to tell your employers that Solomon and Cordelia Thorne are not people who can be intimidated or bought off." The standoff stretched for another long moment, tension crackling in the cold, air like electricity before a storm. Then Morrison gestured sharply to his companions, and they began moving toward their horses with obvious reluctance. "This conversation isn't finished," Morrison called back as he swung into his saddle. "Yes, it is," Cordelia's voice carried clearly. From the cabin doorway, where she now stood with the rifle cradled competently in her arms, The next time you trespass on our property, we'll consider it an act of aggression and respond accordingly." The three riders departed at speed, disappearing into the tree line with the haste of men who had badly miscalculated their opposition. Solomon remained in position until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, then lowered his rifle and walked toward the cabin where his wife waited. "Well," Cordelia said as he approached, "that was educational." "Educational how?" "I learned that my husband is quite capable of tactical thinking under pressure, and that our partnership extends to more than just domestic arrangements." Solomon stopped in front of her, studying her face for signs of the fear she had controlled so admirably during the confrontation. Instead, he found determination, pride, and something that looked remarkably like affection. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine, but Solomon, we need to finish our earlier conversation. Morrison was right about one thing. This isn't over. They'll try other approaches, other pressures. We need to be completely honest with each other if we're going to face whatever comes next as true partners." Inside the cabin, with the immediate threat departed but tension still crackling between them, Solomon and Cordelia faced each other across the space that had become their shared sanctuary. The broken window let in bitter, cold air, a physical reminder of how quickly safety could be shattered by outside forces. "You're right," Solomon said, setting the rifle aside and turning to face her fully. "Complete honesty. No more secrets, no matter how well-intentioned." Cordelia moved to the fire, adding wood with economical movements that spoke of nervous energy needing outlet. "The money doesn't change how I feel about you, but the deception does. These past days, I've been falling in love with a man I thought I understood completely. Finding out he's been hiding something so significant makes me question what else. I don't know. Everything else, you know, my past, my losses, my reasons for choosing this life, all of that has been completely honest." Solomon joined her by the fire, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "The mineral rights are something I've tried to forget myself. They represent opportunities I don't want, complications I've spent 4 years avoiding. $300,000 isn't something you can simply ignore. I've been doing exactly that. The money sits in a bank account in Denver, untouched, except for the minimal amount I draw for supplies. I live as if it doesn't exist because wealth without purpose feels meaningless to me." Cordelia studied his face, searching for truth beneath. His weathered features. What changed? Why consider using it now? You changed things. Morrison's threat makes it clear that your enemies won't be satisfied with one failed intimidation attempt. They'll try legal challenges, financial pressure, possibly more violence. Fighting them effectively requires resources. The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning troubled water. Solomon was acknowledging that their marriage had transformed from legal convenience to something worth defending with every tool at their disposal. "You would use your wealth to protect my inheritance. I would use every advantage we possess to protect what we've built together. Your inheritance, my mineral rights, they're just tools to ensure our future isn't destroyed by men who view other people's happiness as obstacles to their profits." Cordelia reached for his hands, her fingers warming his cold skin with careful tenderness. "Then we face them together, as equal partners with complete honesty between us." "Equal partners," Solomon agreed, "though I have to warn you, dealing with that much money brings complications. Lawyers, accountants, investment decisions, social obligations, all the civilized entanglements I came to the mountains to escape. We'll handle those complications together, but first we need to secure the legal foundation of our marriage beyond any possible challenge." Solomon understood immediately. "The inheritance documents. Morrison's people will try to prove our marriage was fraudulent or temporary. We need documentation that establishes genuine, permanent union." "Exactly, and we need to move quickly, before they can file legal challenges or arrange more direct interference." Outside, wind howled through the pine trees, with a sound like distant wolves, But inside the cabin, warmth and determination prevailed. They spent the remainder of the afternoon planning their strategy, combining Cordelia's business acumen with Solomon's knowledge of local legal procedures. "Judge Whitman will help us," Solomon said, sketching their approach on paper. "He performed the ceremony and understands the stakes. His testimony about our sincerity and the circumstances of our marriage will carry significant weight. I'll need to travel to Helena to update my legal documents, change bank accounts, and establish our joint financial position. Morrison's employers will try to freeze my assets if they can find legal justification. Then we go together. No more separation until this threat is resolved completely." Cordelia smiled at his protective instincts. "Together, yes. But as partners, not as protector and protected. I've been managing complex financial affairs longer than you have." "Understood. Your expertise, my resources, our combined determination." As evening approached, they prepared for the journey to town with the methodical care of people who understood that their enemies wouldn't remain passive. Supplies, ammunition, legal documents, and traveling funds were packed with attention to both immediate needs and potential emergencies. "Solomon," Cordelia said as they made final preparations, "there's something else you should know about my feelings." He paused in checking his rifle, sensing the importance of what she was about to say. "When I discovered the mineral rights deed, my first emotion wasn't anger about the deception. It was relief. Relief that my growing feelings for you weren't influenced by sympathy for your poverty or desire to rescue someone from difficult circumstances. Knowing you're financially independent means that what I feel is genuine attraction to who you are as a person." The admission touched something deep in Solomon's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. "And what you feel is love," Cordelia said simply. "Complicated by recent revelations and current dangers, but love nonetheless. I want to build a real marriage with you, Solomon Thorne. All of you, including the wealthy, secretive, protective aspects I'm still discovering." Solomon pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the rightness of her presence in his arms. "Then we'll build something worthy of that love, starting with making sure Morrison and his employers can't destroy what we've found together." The confrontation with Morrison's legal challenge came 3 weeks later in Judge Whitman's courtroom, where the marriage certificate that had begun as desperate necessity would face its ultimate test. The courtroom was packed with curious townspeople, railroad representatives, and lawyers from both sides, creating an atmosphere of theatrical tension that reminded Solomon uncomfortably of his former business world. Morrison sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 expensive attorneys from back east, their confident bearing suggesting they believed victory was assured. They had spent considerable resources building their case, interviewing witnesses, gathering affidavits, constructing legal arguments designed to invalidate Solomon and Cordelia's marriage on grounds of fraud and temporary intent. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Whitman," the bailiff announced, and the crowded courtroom rustled to attention. Judge Whitman entered with the same measured dignity Solomon remembered from their wedding night, but his expression carried the gravity of someone who understood that justice itself was on trial. As he settled behind the bench, his gaze briefly met Solomon's with a slight nod of recognition and encouragement. "This court is convened to hear the matter of Morrison versus Thorne, a challenge to the validity of a marriage performed in this jurisdiction on the night of December 15th, 1882, Judge Whitman's voice carried clearly through the packed room. "Counselor Morrison, present your case." The lead attorney rose with theatrical flourish, a man accustomed to commanding attention through presence and oratory. "Your Honor, we contend that the marriage between Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth and Mr. Solomon Thorne was a fraudulent arrangement designed solely to circumvent the legal requirements of Mrs. Ashworth's late husband's will. We have evidence that these parties were strangers prior to the marriage, that substantial financial inducements were offered for temporary union, and that both parties intended to dissolve the marriage immediately after the inheritance requirements were satisfied. Solomon felt Cordelia's hand tighten in his as the attorney continued his attack on their relationship, painting their love story as nothing more than calculated deception. But he also noticed something in the lawyer's presentation, a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were and what they had become together. Furthermore, the attorney continued, we contend that Mrs. Ashworth's desperation to retain her inheritance led her to enter into this sham marriage with a man of questionable character and modest means, making the union both fraudulent in intent and unsuitable in practice. That final phrase, modest means, nearly made Solomon smile despite the gravity of the situation. Morrison's people had spent weeks investigating their marriage, but had somehow missed discovering his mineral rights fortune, giving them a devastating surprise. For the defense case, Mr. Henderson, Judge Whitman addressed Cordelia's attorney. Your response? James Henderson rose, a local lawyer whose modest appearance concealed sharp intelligence and deep integrity. Your Honor, we will demonstrate that while this marriage may have begun as a response to unusual circumstances, it has developed into a genuine partnership between two people of good character who chose to build a life together based on mutual respect and affection. Henderson's opening was deliberately understated, setting up the more dramatic revelations to come. Solomon appreciated the strategy. Let Morrison's attorneys commit to their narrative before revealing how badly they had misunderstood the situation. The plaintiff's case proceeded with predictable precision. Witnesses testified about the unusual circumstances of the marriage, the short acquaintance between the parties, and Cordelia's desperate financial situation. Morrison himself took the stand, describing his visit to the cabin and his assessment that the marriage was obviously fraudulent. They were clearly uncomfortable with each other, Morrison testified with smug confidence. Like strangers forced into an awkward business arrangement, no genuine affection, no natural ease between husband and wife. Solomon and Cordelia exchanged glances, remembering how their relationship had actually developed during those early days. Morrison had observed them before they had fully understood their own feelings, but his interpretation revealed more about his assumptions than their reality. When Henderson began the defense case, he called Judge Whitman as his first witness, a strategic choice that established the legitimacy of the ceremony itself. Judge Whitman, please describe the circumstances under which you performed this marriage. Mrs. Ashworth came to me in desperate need of legal ceremony to satisfy her late husband's will requirements, but I insisted on understanding the character of both parties before agreeing to perform the service. What I observed was two people of evident integrity who were treating their unusual circumstances with appropriate seriousness and mutual respect. Did you believe their union was fraudulent? Absolutely not. I believed it was unconventional, but entered into with good faith by both parties. I also believed that genuine feelings were developing between them, even if they hadn't fully recognized those feelings themselves. Henderson nodded and approached his next line of questioning carefully. Judge Whitman, did you have any conditions for performing the ceremony? I did. I required both parties to exchange genuine vows about their intentions toward each other, and I insisted they understand that marriage creates bonds that cannot be entirely dissolved by legal documents. The testimony continued with character. Witnesses who had observed Solomon and Cordelia together in the weeks following their marriage, shopkeepers, neighbors, even Pastor McKenna testified about the obvious compatibility and growing affection between the couple. But Henderson saved his most devastating evidence for last, the mineral rights deed that transformed the entire narrative of their relationship. The revelation of Solomon's mineral rights fortune hit the courtroom like a thunderclap, transforming the entire narrative of their relationship in a single, devastating moment. Henderson presented the geological surveys, the bank records, and the property deeds with methodical precision, watching as Morrison's confident case crumbled before the assembled witnesses. "Ladies and gentlemen," Henderson addressed the courtroom with quiet authority, "the plaintiff's case rests on the assumption that Mrs. Ashworth's wealth made her vulnerable to fortune hunters and desperate enough to enter a fraudulent marriage. But the evidence shows that Mr. Thorne possesses greater personal wealth than Mrs. Ashworth's inheritance, mineral rights valued at over $300,000, held in trust for 4 years without being touched." Solomon watched Morrison's face go ashen as the implications became clear. Their entire legal strategy had been based on portraying him as a poor mountain hermit taking advantage of a wealthy widow's desperation. Instead, they had inadvertently revealed themselves as predatory opportunists, attempting to steal from two independently wealthy individuals who had chosen each other freely. "This means," Henderson continued with devastating logic, "that Mr. Thorne's decision to help Mrs. Ashworth cannot possibly have been motivated by financial gain. Instead, it demonstrates exactly what both parties have testified, a genuine desire to help someone in distress, followed by the natural development of affection between two compatible people." Judge Whitman called for a brief recess, during which Morrison's attorneys huddled in frantic consultation, clearly trying to salvage a case that had just imploded spectacularly. Solomon and Cordelia sat quietly at their table, hands clasped, watching their accusers struggle with the reality that their months of investigation had missed the most crucial facts. "How are you feeling?" Solomon asked softly. "Relieved," Cordelia replied, "not just about winning the case, but about finally having everything in the open between us. No more secrets, no more partial truths, just honest partnership moving forward." When court reconvened, Morrison's lead attorney made a final, desperate attempt to salvage their position. "Your Honor, even accepting Mr. Thorne's financial status, the fact remains that this marriage was entered into for legal convenience rather than romantic love." Judge Whitman leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Counselor, are you suggesting that marriages entered into for practical reasons cannot develop into genuine partnerships, because if so, you would invalidate approximately half the marriages? In this territory, where practical considerations often initiate relationships that become loving unions over time." The point was devastating in its simplicity. Many frontier marriages began as arrangements for mutual survival, protection, or economic advantage, then developed into deep partnerships based on shared experience and growing affection. To invalidate such marriages would undermine the foundation of frontier society itself. Furthermore, Judge Whitman continued, "I have observed this couple personally, both during their marriage ceremony and in subsequent weeks. What I see is two people who have chosen each other freely, who treat each other with evident respect and affection, and who are building a genuine life together. The court finds no evidence of fraud, no evidence of temporary intent, and no evidence that this marriage fails to meet any legal or ethical standard required by Montana Territory law." The judge's gavel fell with finality that echoed through the packed courtroom. "Case dismissed. The marriage between Solomon and Cordelia Thorne is hereby affirmed as legal, valid, and permanent." The celebration that followed was subdued but deeply satisfying. Henderson accepted their grateful thanks with professional modesty, while townspeople who had attended the trial offered congratulations and invitations to various social functions. But Solomon and Cordelia were eager to return to the privacy of their mountain refuge, where they could process their victory without public scrutiny. The journey home took them through familiar terrain, transformed by spring's early arrival. Snow still covered the high peaks, but lower elevations showed signs of winter's retreat. Rushing streams, swollen with snowmelt, the first tentative green of new growth, the return of birds that had wintered in warmer climates. "It's beautiful," Cordelia observed, breathing deeply of the crisp mountain air. "I understand now why you chose this life." "We chose this life," Solomon corrected gently. and we'll keep choosing it together. At the cabin, they found evidence of spring's progress. In the small shoots of green emerging from Cordelia's carefully planned garden plot. She had spent weeks during the legal proceedings designing plantings that would thrive in mountain conditions, creating a space where her roses could flourish alongside vegetables and herbs needed for their increasingly self-sufficient lifestyle. "Look," she said, kneeling beside the emerging plants with obvious delight. "The early lettuce is already sprouting." Solomon watched his wife tend her garden with the same careful attention she brought to all aspects of their shared life. The contrast between the elegant society woman who had arrived at his door months earlier and the capable, determined partner she had become was striking. Yet the core strength and intelligence had always been there, waiting for the right circumstances to flourish. That evening, they sat before the fire, wearing new wedding rings they had chosen together in Helena, simple bands of mountain gold that symbolized their decision to make their marriage permanent and public. The rings replaced the temporary bands from Cordelia's parents, which now rested in a place of honor on the mantelpiece as reminders of love that had endured across generations. "No regrets?" Solomon asked, studying his wife's profile in the firelight. "Only one," Cordelia replied with a smile that transformed her face. "I regret that it took a crisis to bring us together, but I suppose the best things in life often come, disguised as problems to be solved." Outside their windows, the Montana Territory stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, wild and beautiful and filled with possibilities. Inside the cabin, two people who had thought their best days were behind them discovered that sometimes life's greatest adventures begin when you stop looking for them and start building them with someone who chooses to stay. The chess set sat on its table nearby, the carved pieces reflecting Solomon's patient craftsmanship and strategic thinking. But the game that mattered most had already been won. Not through clever moves or calculated risks, but through the simple courage to trust another person with the truth of who they were, wealth and wounds and hopes all included, in choosing each other freely and completely. Solomon and Cordelia had found something more valuable than financial security or social position. They had found partnership that honored both independence and intimacy, a marriage built on choice rather than convenience, and the kind of love that grows stronger through seasons of challenge and change. As spring advanced towards summer, their life together would continue to unfold with the unhurried rhythm of people who had learned to value depth over speed, substance over spectacle. They had faced their greatest test and emerged not just victorious, but genuinely united in purpose and affection. Sometimes Solomon reflected as he watched his wife read by the fire, the most profound journeys begin with a single, desperate choice, and lead to destinations more beautiful than any map could chart.